the Alchemical Opus, the secret marriage of lead and gold. In the summer of 1929, Carl Jung received a manuscript that would consume his attention for the next 30 years. It was sent by a colleague in Munich who had discovered it in the estate of a recently deceased antiquarian. The manuscript, written in Latin with hand-drawn illustrations in faded ink, was an alchemical treatise dating to approximately 1450, authored by an unknown practitioner who signed himself only as Frater Incognitus, the unknown brother. Jung's colleague had sent it because the illustrations confused him. They did not depict the usual alchemical apparatus of furnaces, retorts, and distillation flasks. Instead, they depicted human figures undergoing a series of transformations, figures that bore an unmistakable resemblance to the major arcana of the tarot. Jung opened the manuscript in his study at Bollingen, his retreat on the shores of Lake Zurich, and did not emerge for 3 days. When he finally came out, he was pale and visibly shaken. He told his secretary that he had found something he had been searching for his entire career without knowing it: the missing link between the tarot, alchemy, and the process of psychological transformation. The manuscript did not merely draw parallels between alchemical stages and tarot cards. It presented them as a single, unified system, a map of the human soul's journey from fragmentation to wholeness, described simultaneously in the language of chemistry, symbolism, and narrative. The connection between alchemy and psychology was not new to Jung. He had been studying alchemical texts for years, convinced that the medieval alchemists, far from being primitive chemists chasing the fantasy of turning lead into gold, were actually proto-psychologists who had discovered fundamental truths about the process of inner transformation. The language they used was chemical. The processes they described, nigredo, albedo, citrinitas, rubido, sounded like laboratory procedures. But the substance they were actually working with, Jung believed, was not metal. It was the human psyche itself. The alchemists called their work the opus, the great work. Its goal was the creation of the philosopher's stone, a substance that could transmute base metals into gold and grant eternal life. Jung read this goal symbolically. The philosopher's stone was not a physical substance, but a state of psychological wholeness. The transmutation of lead into gold was not a chemical process, but the transformation of the unconscious, undeveloped psyche into conscious, integrated selfhood. The eternal life the stone promised was not physical immortality, but the experience of living from one's deepest, most authentic center, a state that transcended the fear of death because it transcended the fear of death because it transcended the ego's identification with the temporary and the partial. What the manuscript from Munich revealed, and what Jung would spend decades elaborating, was that the tarot's major arcana could be read as an alchemical text. The 22 cards, when understood in their proper sequence, depicted not merely a journey of personal development, but the stages of the alchemical opus itself. Each card corresponded to a specific phase of the alchemical process, and the entire sequence, from the Fool to the World, described the complete transformation of the psyche from its raw, undifferentiated state to its final, integrated form. The alchemical opus began with what the alchemists called the prima materia, the raw material from which the philosopher's stone would eventually be extracted. The prima materia was described in deliberately contradictory terms. It was the most common substance in the world, available to everyone, yet almost no one recognized it. It was worthless, yet infinitely valuable. It was found in the gutter and in the palace, in the lowest and the highest. The alchemists insisted that the prima materia was so ordinary that people walked past it every day without a second glance. Jung identified the prima materia with the Fool, card 0 of the major arcana. The Fool was the most ordinary figure imaginable, a wanderer with no possessions, no title, no identity, no destination. He was nobody, and he had nothing. Yet the entire alchemical opus began with him. The philosopher's stone was hidden within this apparent nothingness, just as the alchemist said the prima materia was hidden within the most despised and overlooked substance. The Fool's zero was not the zero of emptiness, but the zero of infinite potential, the point from which all numbers arose, the state before differentiation in which all possibilities coexisted. The first stage of the alchemical opus was called the nigredo, the blackening. It was the most feared and most misunderstood phase of the work. In chemical terms, the nigredo involved the decomposition of the prima materia, its reduction to a formless black mass through the application of intense heat. In psychological terms, the nigredo represented the dissolution of the ego, the breakdown of the constructed personality, the confrontation with everything dark, rejected, and terrifying within the psyche. It was, as one alchemist wrote, the death that precedes all birth, the darkness that precedes all light, the dissolution that precedes all creation. Jung mapped the Nigredo onto a sequence of tarot cards that depicted this progressive dissolution with remarkable precision. The process began with the Hanged Man, card 12, who hung suspended upside down, willingly surrendering his normal orientation to the world. This was the first step of the Nigredo, the voluntary abandonment of one's usual way of seeing. The world had to be turned upside down before the real work could begin. Everything the ego had considered important had to be revealed as secondary. Everything it had dismissed as worthless had to be recognized as essential. A patient of Jung's who powerfully embodied the Hanged Man stage was a theologian in his 50s who had devoted his entire life to the church. He had been a model priest, an eloquent preacher, a compassionate counselor to his congregation. But in his 50s, something began to collapse. His faith, which had been the foundation of his entire identity, started to feel hollow. The words he spoke from the pulpit no longer carried conviction. The rituals he performed began to feel mechanical. He experienced a growing sense of dread that he could not explain, a feeling that the ground beneath his life was dissolving. Jung recognized the Nigredo immediately. The theologian's faith had not been false, but it had been one-sided. It had been a faith of light, of goodness, of transcendence, a faith that had no room for darkness, doubt, or the full complexity of human experience. The Nigredo was dissolving this partial faith so that a more complete faith, one that could contain both light and darkness, could eventually emerge. But first, the dissolution had to be endured. The tarot's death card, number 13, depicted the next stage of the Nigredo. The skeleton astride a horse, cutting down everything in its path, king and commoner alike. This was not the death of the body, but the death of the old identity. Everything the theologian had been, his role as priest, his certainty about God, his place in the community, had to die. Not because these things were wrong, but because they had become a prison. The ego had wrapped itself so tightly around these identifications that it had become indistinguishable from them. To free the psyche for further development, the identifications had to be stripped away, and this stripping felt, from the inside, exactly like dying. The alchemists described the Nigredo in imagery that was deliberately horrifying. The substance in the vessel turned black. It putrefied. It gave off the stench of death. Ravens gathered. The king was dismembered, his body parts scattered. The sun was eclipsed. These images were not meant to be taken literally, but they were meant to be taken seriously. The Nigredo was genuinely terrible. It involved the complete breakdown of everything the person had relied upon for their sense of identity and meaning. Those who entered the Nigredo without understanding what was happening often fell into depression, addiction, or despair. Those who entered it consciously, with the guidance of the alchemical tradition, or its psychological equivalent, could endure it with the knowledge that it was a necessary stage, not a final destination. The Tower, card 16, represented the culmination of the Nigredo. If the Hanged Man was voluntary surrender, and the Death card was the organic dissolution of the old identity, the Tower was the violent, involuntary destruction of everything that still remained standing. Lightning struck from above. The crown was blasted from the tower. Figures fell through the air. This was the moment when all illusions were shattered simultaneously, when the last defenses of the ego were breached and the full reality of one's psychological situation was exposed. For the theologian, the tower moment came when he finally admitted to himself, after months of agonizing therapy, that he had entered the priesthood not out of genuine spiritual calling, but out of fear. Fear of the world, fear of his own desires, fear of the freedom and responsibility that secular life demanded. His entire vocation had been, at its deepest root, an elaborate avoidance strategy. This admission shattered his self-image completely. He was not the devoted servant of God he had believed himself to be. He was a frightened man hiding behind a collar. The lightning bolt of this realization left nothing standing. Jung noted in his case files that the theologian spent several weeks in a state of profound psychological darkness following this tower moment. He could not eat. He could not sleep. He could not pray. He described feeling as though he had been reduced to nothing, as though every cell of his being had been taken apart and scattered. Jung recognized this as the completion of the Nigredo. The prima materia had been fully dissolved. The old identity was dead. The question was whether something new would emerge from the ashes. The second stage of the alchemical opus was the albedo, the whitening. If the nigredo was the death of the old, the albedo was the first glimpse of the new. In chemical terms, it involved the purification of the dark mass left by the nigredo, a washing and whitening that separated the pure from the impure. In psychological terms, the albedo represented the emergence of new awareness from the darkness of dissolution, the first light after the long night of the nigredo. The tarot card that Jung identified as the gateway to the albedo was the star, card 17. After the catastrophic destruction of the tower, the star appeared as a figure of profound peace. A naked woman knelt beside a pool of water, pouring liquid from two vessels, one onto the earth and one back into the pool. Above her shone a great star surrounded by 7 smaller stars. The nakedness was significant. After the nigredo had stripped away every false identity, every mask, every construction of the ego, what remained was the naked self, vulnerable but authentic, without pretense or armor. The star represented what the alchemists called the White Queen, the purified feminine principle that emerged from the nigredo's destruction. Jung understood this as the emergence of authentic feeling and intuition from beneath the ruins of the ego's defenses. When the theologian finally began to recover from his tower experience, the first sign of renewal was not a new intellectual understanding or a new set of beliefs. It was a feeling. He described it as a sense of tenderness toward himself and toward the world that he had never experienced before. It was not the sentimental compassion he had preached from the pulpit. It was something rawer, more vulnerable, more real. He said it felt like seeing the world for the first time through eyes that had just been created. The moon, card 18, followed the star in both the tarot sequence and the alchemical process. The albedo was not a simple transition from darkness to light. It involved a passage through the territory of the deep unconscious, the moonlit landscape of dreams, illusions, and half-truths that lay between the darkness of the nigredo and the full light of consciousness. The alchemists described this phase as perilous. The substance had been purified, but it had not yet been stabilized. It was in a fluid, impressionable state, vulnerable to contamination and regression. The seeker who had survived the nigredo could still lose their way in the deceptive light of the moon. The theologian's passage through the moon phase manifested as a period of intense confusion and emotional volatility. Having lost his old identity, he did not yet have a new one. He vacillated between moments of profound clarity and periods of utter bewilderment. Old fears and desires, which the nigredo had released from their prison in the unconscious, surged through him unpredictably. He was tempted to retreat into his old identity, to put the collar back on and pretend that nothing had happened. The moon's half-light made everything uncertain. Was the dissolution he had experienced genuine transformation or simply a breakdown? Was the tenderness he was feeling authentic renewal or merely the vulnerability of a shattered ego? These questions could not be answered rationally. They could only be navigated through trust, patience, and the willingness to keep walking a path that could not be clearly seen. The third stage of the alchemical opus was the trinitas, the yellowing, a stage that many later alchemists merged with the rubedo, but that the earlier tradition carefully distinguished. The trinitas represented the dawn, the first light of the sun after the long night of nigredo, and the uncertain twilight of the albedo. In psychological terms, it was the emergence of genuine insight, the moment when the seeker began to understand not just emotionally, but intellectually what the entire process had been about. The sun, card 19, corresponded to the trinitas with perfect precision. The image on the card was unmistakable, a great sun shining with full radiance, a child riding a white horse in a garden of sunflowers. The child was not the fool of card 0. This was a new innocence, born from the wisdom of experience rather than the ignorance of inexperience. The sunflowers all turned toward the light, indicating that consciousness was now the organizing principle of the psyche. The darkness had not been eliminated, but it was now illuminated. The unconscious material that had been released by the nigredo and navigated during the albedo was now being integrated into conscious awareness. For the theologian, the trinitas arrived as a new understanding of his vocation. He did not return to the priesthood in his old way, nor did he abandon it entirely. Instead, he found a new relationship with his calling, one that was honest about its origins and fear, while also recognizing that something genuine had grown alongside the fear over the decades. His faith was no longer a refuge from life, but a way of engaging with life in its fullness, including its darkness, its uncertainty, and its suffering. The sun had risen not on a new faith that denied the darkness, but on a faith that had been through the darkness and had emerged transformed. The fourth and final stage was the rubedo, the reddening, the completion of the opus, and the creation of the philosopher's stone. In chemical terms, the rubedo involved the union of opposites, the marriage of the white queen and the red king, the feminine and masculine principles into a single unified substance. In psychological terms, it represented the full integration of all aspects of the psyche, conscious and unconscious, masculine and feminine, light and shadow, rational and intuitive. This was the state Jung called individuation, the condition of being fully oneself, undivided and complete. The tarot depicted the rubedo in the final two cards of the major arcana, Judgment, card 20, and the World, card 21. Judgment showed figures rising from coffins in response to an angelic trumpet call. This was the moment of final awakening, the moment when every aspect of the psyche that had been dead, buried, or forgotten was called back to life and integrated into the whole. The resurrection depicted in the card was not the resurrection of the old ego, but the resurrection of everything the ego had buried, the shadow, the anima or animus, the memories and desires and capacities that had been pushed into the unconscious over a lifetime. The World card depicted the rubedo in its completion. A dancing figure surrounded by a laurel wreath, the four creatures of the elements occupying the four corners. The same four symbols that had appeared on the magician's table at the beginning of the journey were now integrated into the fabric of reality itself. Nothing had been rejected. Everything had been included. Jung was careful to distinguish the alchemical understanding of the opus from the popular misconception that psychological transformation was a smooth, linear process of self-improvement. The alchemists knew better. They described their work as an opus contra naturam, a work against nature, meaning that it required going against the natural tendency of the ego to maintain its comfortable illusions. The nigredo was not a minor inconvenience on the way to enlightenment. It was a genuine death, experienced as such by anyone who underwent it honestly. The albedo was not a comfortable recovery, but a disorienting passage through territory where the rules of ordinary reality did not apply. The citrinitas was not a moment of simple insight, but a fundamental reorganization of consciousness that changed how the person perceived everything. The manuscript from Munich, which had sparked Jung's 30-year investigation, contained a detail that he found particularly significant. The unknown brother had drawn, alongside his illustrations of the alchemical stages, a sequence of 22 circles arranged in a spiral. Each circle contained a symbol that corresponded to a major arcana card, and the spiral moved inward from the Fool at the outermost ring to the World at the center. But at the very center where the World card was placed, the spiral did not end. It opened into another spiral, this one moving outward, beginning again with the Fool. This image captured what Jung considered the most important truth about the alchemical opus, that the process was not linear, but spiral. One did not pass through the nigredo once and emerge permanently transformed. One passed through it again and again, at deeper levels, each cycle of death and rebirth carrying the psyche further into the territory of wholeness. The philosopher's stone was not a final achievement, but an ongoing process, a way of relating to life that embraced transformation rather than resisting it, that welcomed the nigredo's darkness as the necessary precondition for each new level of awareness. A second case from Jung's practice illustrated this spiral quality with particular clarity. A woman named Margaretha, a scientist in her 40s, came to Jung after experiencing what she described as a second breakdown. She had undergone a profound psychological crisis in her 20s that had led to years of therapy and what she believed was genuine transformation. She had integrated her shadow, developed her emotional capacities, found meaningful work, and built authentic relationships. By her mid-30s, she considered her psychological work complete. Then, in her early 40s, the darkness returned. Not the same darkness she had faced in her 20s, but a deeper, more subtle version. The issues were not the same, but the process felt eerily familiar. The dissolution. The loss of certainty. The confrontation with aspects of herself she had believed were already integrated. She was confused and frightened. Had her earlier transformation been an illusion? Had she merely rearranged her defenses rather than genuinely transforming them? Jung reassured her that what she was experiencing was not a failure but a deepening. He pulled out the manuscript with its spiral diagram and showed her how the opus repeated itself at ever deeper levels. Her first crisis had taken her through the nigredo of her personal shadow, her individual repressions and denials. This second crisis was taking her through a deeper nigredo, one that addressed not her personal psychology, but her relationship to the collective unconscious, to the archetypal patterns that shaped not just her individual life, but human existence itself. The tarot cards that had been central to her first transformation, the Death card, the Tower, the Star, reappeared in her dreams and in their therapeutic work, but with different qualities. The Death card in her 20s had represented the death of her childhood identity. The Death card now represented something vaster, the dissolution of her identification with any fixed identity at all, the recognition that the self was not a thing to be constructed, but a process to be lived. The Tower in her 20s had destroyed specific illusions about her family and her past. The Tower now was destroying something more fundamental, her belief that she could ever reach a final state of completion, her attachment to the idea of a finished self. Jung used the alchemical framework to help Margaretha understand that each turn of the spiral required the same courage and the same willingness to endure dissolution that the first turn had demanded. The nigredo did not become easier with repetition. If anything, it became harder, because each successive level addressed deeper and more fundamental aspects of the psyche. But the rewards also deepened. Each completed cycle did not just restore the person to their previous level of functioning. It carried them to a new level of awareness that had not been accessible before. The alchemists had a saying for this: solve et coagula, dissolve and coagulate. The opus consisted of an endless alternation between dissolution and reconstitution, between the breaking apart of old forms and the creation of new ones. This was not a defect of the process, but its essential nature. Life itself was an alchemical opus, an ongoing dance between creation and destruction, form and formlessness, the gold of conscious awareness and the lead of unconscious potential. One aspect of the alchemical opus that the tarot captured with particular subtlety was the role of the coniunctio, the sacred marriage of opposites. The alchemists described this as the union of the Red King and the White Queen, the masculine and feminine principles within the alchemical vessel. This union was depicted most precisely in Temperance, card 14. Temperance showed an angelic figure pouring liquid between two vessels, blending and balancing opposing elements. The angel stood with one foot on land and one in water, bridging the worlds of consciousness and the unconscious. This card represented the patient, ongoing work of integration that was necessary between each major phase of the opus. After each nigredo, a period of temperance was required, a careful blending and balancing of the new material that had been released from the unconscious with the existing structure of conscious awareness. Without this integration, the transformation remained incomplete, and the released material could become destructive rather than creative. Jung observed that many people experienced the dramatic phases of the opus, the nigredo's darkness, the tower's destruction, the sun's illumination, but failed to do the quiet, unglamorous work of temperance. They sought transformation as a series of peak experiences rather than as a sustained practice of integration. The alchemists warned against this in vivid terms. They described an operator who heated the vessel too quickly, who tried to skip stages or rush the process. The result was always the same: the vessel shattered, the material was lost, and the work had to begin again from the beginning. The practical implication of this warning was that genuine transformation required patience, sustained attention, and the willingness to do unglamorous work over long periods of time. The nigredo was dramatic. The tower was spectacular. But temperance, the quiet daily practice of integrating what had been learned, of slowly incorporating new awareness into the fabric of everyday life, was where the real work of the opus occurred. It was not the lightning bolt that created the philosopher's stone. It was the slow, patient, invisible work that followed. The Devil card, number 15, represented what the alchemists called the cata pavonis, the peacock's tail, a stage of false colors and deceptive beauty that often appeared between the albedo and the rubedo. The alchemist, seeing beautiful colors in the vessel, might believe the work was nearly complete. But the peacock's tail was a trap. The beautiful colors were not the gold of the philosopher's stone, but the false gold of spiritual inflation, the state in which the ego claimed the transformative experience as its own achievement and used it to inflate rather than dissolve itself. In psychological terms, the devil represented the persistent power of unconscious attachments and identifications that survived even significant transformation. A person who had undergone genuine spiritual or psychological growth could still be enslaved by subtle forms of pride, superiority, or attachment to the identity of being a transformed person. The devil's chains, as depicted in the tarot, were always shown loose enough to be removed. The bondage was maintained not by force, but by the person's unwillingness to see it. The devil stage humbled the seeker, reminding them that the opus was never complete as long as any unconscious attachment remained. The manuscript from Munich contained a final illustration that Jung found profoundly moving. It depicted the entire alchemical opus compressed into a single image, a figure standing in a garden, one hand holding a crucible from which smoke rose in the shape of a spiral, the other hand open and empty, receiving rain from a cloud above. Beneath the figure's feet, dark roots spread into the earth. Above the figure's head, stars were arranged in the pattern of the major arcana. The figure was neither male nor female, or rather both simultaneously, the masculine and feminine principles united in a single form. Around the border of the illustration, the unknown brother had written in Latin a single sentence that Jung would return to for the rest of his life: Lapis non fit, revelatur, semper aderat. The stone is not made, it is revealed. It was always there. Jung closed the manuscript and placed it in the locked cabinet in his study where he kept his most important documents. He would return to it again and again over the following decades, finding new depths in its illustrations each time, discovering correspondences he had missed before, recognizing patterns that only became visible as his own understanding deepened. The unknown brother had been dead for 5 centuries, but his work was still teaching, still revealing, still demonstrating the truth that the alchemists had always insisted upon, that the opus had no final end, that the spiral continued as long as consciousness existed, and that the work was never about creating something that did not yet exist. It was about learning to see what had been there all along, hidden in plain sight, waiting in the most ordinary substance, in the most overlooked corner, in the last place anyone would think